This lecture is on the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is basically like 1880s into 1914. Once again, 1914 is going to be the cutoff because that is when you're going to have the rise of World War I. And people are more consumed about with what's going on with the war than, in a sense, what's going on domestically. So the Progressive Era, this time period for the progressives, and real before I start, progressives, women are going to play a very large role within the Progressive Era, but also you'll see a lot of progress for women. So the Progressive Era is actually really important for women just overall, all around. So when you talk about the Progressive Era, it's basically a time period where there's an ideology in the country about progress. And there's a huge push to make life better. There's an idea that people should become a part of their society to solve the problems of society. And that's where you get this term progressive, because they want to make progress. It is also a belief that the environment shapes a person's development, so make a better environment. Many women, as I had said, are going to be a part of the progressive movement in some way, shape, or form. But also there will be a lot of things within the progressive movement that are actually going to support women. So when you talk about like the issues of progressives, I want to kind of go over them briefly. There's definitely slides on your PowerPoint on progressivism. Issues of progressivism. There are a lot. There are a ton of issues of progressivism, and people will kind of pick and choose which issues are important to them and what they get involved in. But just kind of give you an overview of kind of the issues of progressivism. They want to limit the power of big business, so they're going to be anti-monopoly, and that's a big movement in the country at this point in time. They also want to make the political system more representative. They're going to push for referendums, recalls, initiatives, and direct primaries. Also, when you talk about the political system, they are going to encourage women the right to vote. And also, they want to kind of clean up politics. They want to kind of get away from kind of corrupt, what they believe is corrupt government, and make it basically not correct. They want to clean it up. Other things, they want to extend the role of government to protect public interests. Things such as poverty and social problems, they basically want the government to step up and deal with these issues. They will work for getting rid of child labor, regulation of working hours, minimum wage laws, insurance for illness, accident, and unemployment, also for old age. They will deal with housing codes, reforms in education. They also want what's referred to as graduated income tax. A graduated income tax is where the wealthy pay a higher percentage of tax, and then it goes down in your economic level until you get to kind of the poor level where they're paying a smaller percentage of tax. That's what we have today as a graduated income tax. Now, the things that I have listed off, there are some things that they're going to achieve and some things they're not going to achieve. They're really not going to deal with a lot of the labor issues. They're not going to get rid of child labor laws, minimum wage laws, they really won't get rid of working hours or change working hours and the poor conditions. And so they won't get like insurance for illness, accident, unemployment, old age. So there are things that they're not going to achieve. They will achieve many things, but they won't achieve everything. And then who are they? The progressives are usually middle class or wealthy. And it's the fact that you have to have the time and the resources to be a part of this movement. And most of them are college educated in the sense that the men would be college educated and they might be married to a wife that's not college educated, but she's kind of pulled into that because of her husband being college educated. The women themselves might be college educated or have some some education like past high school. And you definitely see, as I said, a lot of women being a part of it. It's both men and women, but a lot of women will be a part of it. Another thing is that they tend to be Protestant, and it has nothing to do with religion. It's because at this point in time, Protestants tend to be middle class and above. And they have just the time and the availability to do it. So when you talk about, there's one other thing before I move on. I want to talk about muckrakers within the progressive movement. Muckrakers is going to be kind of like a group of people within the progressive movement, and muckrakers are journalists, and journalists, men and women, journalists that are going to show the problems of society. So they're going to write the stories showing all the problems in society, and then that way, if they write about the stories, then people can get involved in them, and then hopefully they will make a change. They'll write stories about anti-monopoly. They'll write stories about poverty, children, or lack of education for poor children. They will write about problems within in the factories and the poor working conditions in the factories. And they definitely do make some changes, or I guess they do make changes. When you talk about muckrakers, an example for us would be Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell is a muckraker journalist, and she's going to write extensively about monopolies, or she's going to write, well, about monopolies because she's trying to push the anti-monopoly movement. She is going to write about Standard Oil as a monopoly, and her writing and her essays that she writes and basically publishes on a monthly basis is actually going to put pressure on the federal government to actually break up Standard Oil as a monopoly. So this is definitely a good example of a muckraker that is actually going to change society and change various things in society. Okay, other things and kind of focusing on women. Education. Within the progressive movement, there's a huge push for education overall. Progressives are very much about education, whether it's for children, whether it's about just across the board, just better education, and or education for women. And so there's a huge push and movement for women to pursue more education. Definitely at a higher level. They're really encouraging women to try and get into college. The catch with that is you have to have money to go to college. So this would definitely be middle class and above. But because of that, 1890 into the 1900s, you're going to see colleges, women colleges, either develop or expand. You'll have Barnard, that's in New York City. You'll have Bryn Mawr, Mount Holyoke, Radcliffe, Smith, Vassar, Wellesley. All these colleges are women's colleges, and either they're either have developed or they have expanded their curriculum. And there was always this belief of women being delicate things, and so there were like certain courses that it wasn't promoted for women to take. And so this is and also not promoting like strenuous activity in college because women were delicate things. Also at this time, women are going to say, enough with that. It should be basically an equal education, equal higher education for women as for men. A woman by the name, she goes by M. Carey Thomas. She is going to be president of Bryn Mawr, and she believed that women should have serious scholarship, meaning any type of, it should be the equal scholarship that a man would get. So at Bryn Mawr College, the curriculum was basically similar to what a man would have in college. But also, sometimes when women became college educated, sometimes they had difficulty fitting into society because sometimes they had difficulty actually getting jobs. A good example would be like lawyers. They would have a really hard time getting jobs. But also you become college educated, and then you might meet your husband, and then you get married, and you really don't do anything with your college education. And that's not necessarily a negative thing because the person's educated, but there's kind of this, it's kind of created by society. Society, there's a movement to have women more educated, but it doesn't translate in society for them to get access into jobs, and they're kind of expected to kind of leave everything behind when they get married. So sometimes women kind of found it a little bit difficult as far as kind of finding a place in the world after they become educated. Having said that, you will definitely see many women going into the teaching profession, nursing, and then also social work. Social work will become a profession for women during the progressive era. All right, also African American women, also you will see more African American women going into college. More colleges are accepting African American women. Either there'll be African American colleges or they're just being accepted into college. Some good examples, they had teacher training programs at Oberlin in Ohio, Wilberforce University in Ohio, Scotia Academy, also Spelman Academy. They all accepted African American. Spelman would be African American college. An example would be Marie Baldwin at Cambridge, Massachusetts. She will actually teach, she'll get a teaching credential, and she'll teach at Agassiz Grammar School, and then became principal, and she was at that school for 30 years. Okay, another part of the progressive movement for women is going to be what's known as the women's club movement. I've been talking about that for a while now. There have been women's organizations, women's service organizations, and also like a women's club movement. And you will see more women having women's associations or women's clubs, and they will definitely expand in number during the progressive era. And in this time period, it could be a lot of different things. You could have like a women's club that's more cultural, it's more personal, meaning it might be like a literary club, more of a social club, but many of the clubs actually wanted to do something for society. Then you could have a club that kind of did a little social stuff, but then they were really looking to better the conditions in their community. And women will say, especially when you hear this rhetoric in the progressive era, that they believe they had special talents and moral responsibility, and that would translate to civic problems, dealing with civic problems. And so another thing is these clubs are going to once again teach women how to organize. It teaches them how to work with other people. It teaches them how to organize. And it also teaches them how to deal with other groups of people. So if you had a women's club that basically said they wanted to create a park, you know, in their city, well, they have to deal with the city council. They have to deal with city government to get this done. And so it was a way for women to do things for themselves and learn how to do these things. And for some women, they had never really had those opportunities before. So that can be a very good thing. I am going to give you an example, or give you some examples of some various women's clubs. You have the National Council of Jewish Women. You will have the National Federation of Afro-American Women, the Colored Women's League, also the National Association for Colored Women. These are definitely some very specific communities, but they were all across the board. Okay, now also within this time period of the progressive movement, there's definitely going to be reform movements in the sense that they basically want to reform something, they want to help something, but it's under the big umbrella of progressivism. You're going to have a reform movement, and this is actually going to be out west. You're going to have a woman by the name of Helen Hunt Jackson, who had been very interested in the plight of Native Americans, and she really wanted to recognize and bring forth the injustices that have been done through the years to the Native Americans. She'll write a book called A Century of Dishonor. And the book doesn't do well at all. It basically talks about a history of Native Americans and a century of dishonor done to the Native Americans. And the book doesn't do well, like, at all. It doesn't go anywhere. And then she will basically be kind of connected to the California Native Americans, and she will hear of this murder that will occur actually in the Ramona area of California, just south of us. And so she's like, wait a minute, maybe I will take basically something that happened, this, murder that happened, and it's kind of like a little bit of a love triangle. And so she kind of takes the story about this kind of tragic love story that ends up in murder. And she's like, I'm going to write a book, basically Ramona, about this love story. And within this tragic love story, and within this novel, I'm going to basically weave in the problems and the injustices done to the Native Americans. And so she's going to write a book called Ramona. It's published in 1884, and it is a huge hit. It is a bestseller. It is, everybody has to read Ramona. And it's fabulous, okay? And she's like, oh, finally, right? But then also, right as the book is being published, she starts to fall into ill health because she's starting to get older. And she's starting to get into ill health. And she really can't promote her book, Ramona. But in a sense, it doesn't need promoting because it's basically a bestseller. But the problem is that people are more caught up in the tragic love story, and oh my God, it's in Southern California, and I want to go to Southern California, and I want to see where this all happened, and I want to see California. And that's why people read Ramona. They're actually not reading it to talk about the problems of the Native Americans. And that's the thing that she can't promote, because she really can't promote her book because she's in ill health. She'll actually pass away a couple of years later. But it's her attempt to try and deal with the plight of the Native Americans, because she wanted it to be kind of like a reform movement. Unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily turn out that way. Okay, another thing that would be listed under reform movements is what's known as a settlement house movement. Settlement houses, it's basically started in England, in London, and you're going to have two women, Jane Addams and Ellen Starr. Jane Addams and Ellen Starr are both college-educated women. They're like higher middle class. They're college-educated, and they will basically take a trip to London. And when they're in London, they will run into these settlement houses. And settlement houses are basically settlement houses for the poor. And so they basically are looking at each other going, we should do that back home. So they go back into the United States. They're from Chicago, and they're going to create Hull House. And Hull House is going to be the first settlement house in the United States. And so the concept of Hull House, or for settlement houses, is that it's a place where the poor can go and they can get help, they can get assistance, and they can get help and assistance in a variety of ways. And so Jane Addams, Ellen Starr are going to create the settlement Hull House, and they basically start this settlement house movement. Settlement house movement will be all over the United States. I would say more on the east, basically east of the Mississippi River, and you see it in large urban cities. Okay. Now, what does Hull House do? What does settlement houses do? They're basically trying to help the poor. They're trying to be a way for the poor to help better themselves. So you can go into a settlement house if you're poor, and you can get, like if you need medical care, or like your kids are sick and you really don't have access to medical care, you can go to Hull House or a settlement house, and they would have nurses, and they would basically be able to help you, give you advice, and if they really believe that you needed to see a doctor, they would actually get you to a doctor, no charge to the person. And they would basically, like if you have a kid who's sick and you're not really quite sure what to do with the kid, they would basically kind of teach you how to deal with that illness and kind of how to deal with issues. And if the kid really needed to see a doctor, then they would take it to a doctor. If you needed to try and better yourself, like women would want to try and get some type of education. They want to get out of the factories. They want to learn a better skill like typing or taking shorthand to perhaps become a secretary or some type of assistant, like office assistant. They provided classes in that. And you could bring your children, and they had like daycare there. They also were concerned with the kids in that aspect for the poor, that they really weren't getting the education that they needed from the very beginning at home. And so they offered like preschools and kindergarten classes to teach the kids very basic education, like numbers and letters and numbers and shapes and colors and all that good stuff, to hopefully get them basically set so they could go into like elementary school and not be far behind. It was only preschool and kindergarten. It never went beyond that. Another thing is because a lot of your immigrants are going to be poor, it also offered like English classes, kind of classes on like, in a sense, how to be American. Kind of cooking classes if you don't know how to do that, how to take care of your baby. Because with immigrants, a lot of times young families will come over or a couple will come over and all their relatives are in Europe. And so you can't rely on mom or an aunt or anything like that. And so you rely on a settlement house. And so they would try and help you in that sense. They weren't necessarily like a clearinghouse so you can like get money or go stay there for a while. It was trying to provide you skills so you could better yourself in society. Now, another thing is like, and a good example is like, let's say a mom brings in a kid who's sick, right? And they take care of the kid, they give her advice on what to do. They send her back home. Then they basically have her address. And then maybe like 2 days later, they're going to send somebody from the settlement house to go check on the mom and kid. And this is going to be the beginning of social work. And so this actually becomes a very prominent part of settlement house work, is after somebody comes into a settlement house for something, they will then send an employee out a couple days later to go check on that family, that woman. And that is the beginning of social work. You'll have women who are in the settlement house, working in the settlement houses, and they're like, wow, I really like this. Like, this is what I want to do. Over time, what that's going to do is it's actually going to encourage women to get education, and you'll actually have education that is basically formed around social work. And so social work will actually become a profession, and it will be a profession for women, and it will be a middle class profession because you definitely have to have education for that. Now, another thing that settlement houses also provided, it provided another view of life to women. And they could look up to Ellen Starr and Jane Addams or whoever was running a Hull House. A lot of times it was women. And basically they saw women that were college educated and that were running a settlement house. And it's like, wow, I can do that too. I can become educated. I want to become educated. I see another avenue for myself. Or I want to become a nurse, I want to become a teacher, I want to become a social worker. And so it's showing women other avenues just besides growing up, getting married, and having kids. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's just showing them more opportunities if they care to do so. And so that's another thing that progressivism does for women, is it shows them different avenues or just different ways of living. And a lot of it has to do with education. There was one other thing that I wanted to mention. With Hull House. When you talk about Hull Houses and the people who work at settlement houses, Some of them are going to be paid workers. You will actually have women that are teachers, that are nurses, that are social workers, and they are actually being paid by settlement houses. You could also have a huge amount of volunteers. You could have a woman who volunteers to teach preschool, or a woman who volunteers to kind of do social work. She's not necessarily a social worker, but she will volunteer her time. And this is a way for women to be involved in the progressive movement by like donating their time in a settlement house. And like if you have kids, right, and they're already in school and you're middle class and your kids are in school, you might be able to donate your time between like 9 and 1. And then you'd be able to then be home with the kids. So the Hull House was a variety of things. You had people who were actually paid, but you also had volunteers. And it also, as I said, it's opening opportunities and kind of showing women different ways to live their life. And definitely just kind of for them to choose on how they want to do it. Now, a woman who is definitely going to be paid would be Florence Kelley. Florence Kelley is actually graduating. She had graduated from Cornell University, and she will actually come to work at Hull House. And she was a paid employee. And as she's working in Hull House, she really becomes now acquainted with the plight of the poor, and basically poor women and the poor children. And this becomes basically her life's work. She'll actually go back to school and become an attorney, and she will work as an attorney to deal with women and child issues. Okay, now African American women. African American women or African American community will have their own settlement houses. Sarah Fernandez, it's Fernandis. She will found the first African American settlement house in Washington, D.C. After that's founded and takes off, she'll found another one in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. And so it's the same thing, okay? They're providing social and educational services for the poor within the African American community. Okay, another movement within the progressive movement is going to be the temperance movement. This is something that I have talked about throughout this class. Once again, you're going to kind of have like a momentum in this time period, 1880s, basically like 1870s, kind of to 1814, to the edge of World War I. And once again, there's kind of a momentum. By this time, you're going to have an organization that will form. It's the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, and that is one of the largest women's organizations. And in this time period, like 1880s, approximately 176,000 members. You're going to have a woman by the name of Frances Willard, who will be president 1879 to 1898. Under her leadership, she's definitely going to obviously promote temperance, okay? But she'll also then try to promote a movement of creating boy and girls clubs. And these would be for orphaned children, like industrial orphans, or I should say orphans coming from industrial families. And then also ways for children who are basically coming from alcoholic homes. And she basically wanted them to have a safe place, kind of like after school, or created schools and kind of like an after school thing, but it was also integrated with schools. So she's trying to help out more than just trying to get rid of alcohol. Your boys and girls clubs will reach out to all various races, ethnicities. It did not matter to her. Okay, now another movement within the progressive movement, or another, if you want to call it reform movement, within the progressive movement, is going to be the women's suffrage movement. And this is because there's going to be a huge encouragement of women in society to participate in society, to better themselves through education, but it's also about women getting rights for themselves. And so progressives on a whole, in general, will be very supportive of women getting the right to vote. And so you're definitely going to see these associations that I have talked about in a previous lecture. You have the National Women's Suffrage Association and also the American Women's Suffrage Association will actually unite in 1890. Those two organizations are going to unite and they're going to create the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They're going to unite in 1890 and it's going to be the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Elizabeth Cady Stanton will be its first president, okay, starting in 1890. But by 1892, her time as president is going to come to an end. And it has to do with Elizabeth Cady Stanton's views. She wants the right to vote, okay, but she also wants easy divorces or much easier divorces. She'll also start to say that religion has a role in promoting oppression of women. And they believe, people in the organization believe that those other two beliefs are kind of hurting or kind of preventing the organization from moving forward. Because especially if you're religious, this whole talk about women oppressing women or religion oppressing women might not sit well with religious people. And then also some people, you know, the whole divorce thing's kind of iffy. And so they kind of feel that those kind of extreme views of hers is kind of holding them back. And so she will actually resign, and Susan B. Anthony will be president in 1892. She'll basically pick it up. From when Susan B. Anthony becomes president in 1892, from the beginning, she talks about women being voters would clean up politics. Women would make politics more humane and more democratic. And that was really her big push. She doesn't have the radical ideas of Stanton, and she basically wants to get back on target of really promoting what women can do for voting and what women can do for the country if they voted. By 1910, California is going to embrace progressivism. They're going to elect a man by the name of Hiram Johnson. Hiram Johnson will come into office in 1910, a strong progressive, and he will definitely be supportive of women getting the right to vote in California, and women will get the right to vote in California in 1911. And that's not a coincidence. Women get the right to vote in 1911 because of Hiram Johnson and because of his government. Okay, now, having said that, okay, and having said that there's a huge promotion or the strong promotion of women getting the right to vote at this point in time, there's definitely going to be opposition, and there's actually strong opposition within the country of people not wanting women to vote. And there's a strong opposition by men and women of saying that politics would contaminate women. It would basically corrupt them. And if it corrupted the women, then it would corrupt the homes, the schools, and the children. So women should remain virtuous and not get involved in politics. They will actually found an organization called the National Association Opposed to the Further Extension of Suffrage to Women. I will repeat that. It's a very long term, okay? The National Association Opposed to the Further Extension of the Suffrage to Women, okay? The membership is actually extremely strong, and membership is actually higher than the National Association of Women, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, that combined one. So it is actually has a larger number of members than an organization trying to promote women voting. So my whole point with that is that there's a very strong opposition to women voting. Now, the National Women's Suffrage, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, that's the one that's combined, one more time, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, is going to have a president, Anna Howard Shaw, in 1904. Anna Howard Shaw, 1904, president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, will try to stay kind of middle of the road. She tries to pick her words very carefully during this time. And she will basically say that women are needed to vote to become more effective reformers and caregivers. So she's choosing her words very carefully because she knows she has great opposition. And she wants to choose her words very carefully because she doesn't want to like irritate anybody that she could potentially lose. So she kind of changes the rhetoric and saying that women need to vote to become more effective reformers and caretakers. And then also, she'll also promote education for women. Okay, now, one other part, still talking about suffrage. When you talk about race and suffrage, there's a huge recruitment, there's trying, within various groups of women, they're going to try and recruit different groups, different ethnicities, saying, you know, women are all the same and we should get all the various ethnicities kind of to support the women's suffrage movement. So there's definitely going to be, within some people, try to recruit Native American into the organization. I mean, if you think about Native American women, many tribes had given women a lot of power, and they had voting rights, and they had a lot of power within their tribes. So that actually makes a huge amount of sense. Alice Paul is going to be a huge force within the suffrage movement, and she really wants to reach out to various ethnicities. And especially she wants to reach out to Hispanic community. Not everybody's happy with that, okay? And she'll basically break away from the National Association, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she will create what's known as the Congressional Union. And the Congressional Union is a suffrage association. And she's trying to bring in Native American women and also Hispanic women. Now, that is going to be in 1913 when she creates the Congressional Union. Then she'll also create another organization in 1916, and that is the National Women's Party. It's not a political party, but more of an organization that's going to fight for women, for women's suffrage. Now, when you talk about African Americans, there's not a huge promotion of African American women to join the other organizations. They kind of had tried it once, and there was tension, and you don't necessarily see a huge push for it again. It's kind of hit and miss, and it tends to be a very kind of personal decision on what kind of organizations women will join. And also, if you have African American women in an organization and you have women who aren't open to that, they feel like they'll lose support for that. So they have to be kind of very careful with that, unfortunately, which is really sad. Now, a few here and there will join Adela Hunt. Adela Hunt Logan will belong to the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she'll also belong to the National Association of Colored Women. And Logan will actually write one of the most solid arguments for women's suffrage. She will say that a government of the people, for the people, and by the people is but partially realized as long as women have no vote. I will repeat that one more time. Government of the people, for the people, and by the people is but partially realized so long as women have no vote, which is 100% true. Then what you tend to see is African Americans just kind of creating their own organizations. They will organize like the National Association of Colored Women, which is large on a large scale, and then they'll also create more regional or more kind of smaller groups. For example, you have the Women's Suffrage Club of Louisiana. You have the Women's Suffrage Club of Tuskegee, Alabama. You also have the Women's Club of Alabama. So then you can kind of have smaller regional ones also. the African Americans definitely, in a sense, saw it correctly. They saw it as twofold. They saw it as a woman's issue, and they also saw it as a race issue, which is 100% true. All right, that is going to conclude my, or this is going to be part of my progressive lecture. I'm going to try and break the lecture into two because it's definitely a long lecture. So there will be a second lecture on progressivism.